Well, good evening, everyone. We're so glad that you're here with us. My name is Kelly Yates, and I'm with the Kentucky Sheep and Goat Development Office. And we're here with Rusty Burgett tonight to talk about the National Sheep Improvement Program. This webinar is brought to you by the Kentucky Sheep and Wool Producers Association. They did a survey amongst their members last year, and NSIP was one of the top 3 things that people wanted to learn about. So here we go. Here's the first step in teaching you about NSIP. I know we have got brand new people to this, all the way up to people who've been using it for 2 or 3 years. I'm excited to see what kind of questions and things that you all have. As I mentioned earlier, we're here with Rusty. Rusty has a master's in small ruminant nutrition. He hails from Ohio. He served as the director of the sheep research program at the University of Wisconsin Spooner Ag Research Station for a while, so he got to work with some dairy sheep there. And now he is in Ames, Iowa, working with the National Sheep Improvement Program. Rusty, I know you've got some sheep right now. Why don't you give us a little background on what your operation looks like?
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, thanks everyone for letting me visit with you here this evening. It's I wish we could be doing it in person, but the world we live in right now, we're going to mix and lemonade out of these lemons we've been dealt. So it's still nice to visit with you a little bit, even though it's from afar. So yeah, I'm sitting here and actually live in a town called Perry, Iowa. So we're about 30 miles or so southwest of Ames. We are kind of at the very western edge of where all the storm damage just started out a couple weeks ago. So we lost a little roofing off the barn and a bunch of trees and flattened a whole bunch of corn. So that was fun to deal with. But I raise small flock of commercial ewes here. My background was managing university flocks and other people's flocks until I started working with NSIP and started with 6 polypay ewes. What was that, 3 years ago? And we've doubled the flock every year since then. So that's our goal, is to keep doubling that flock every year. This year we've been big enough to get some rented pasture. We outgrew our current place, so now we're renting some grass out there. Praying for some rain, and we can continue to have some grass here, and focus mostly on producing commercial sheep. I do have my flock on NSIP, but my main goal isn't producing breeding stock. I really focus on the commercial side of things, selling lamb and wool. And we can get into the details of why that is later on, kind of how I use the program in my operation. But that's a little bit about me. So I've got my wife and a 2-year-old son here. You might hear crying here in about 30 minutes when he has to go to bed. But they help me out with the sheep, and we have a great time doing it.
We have got 11 questions. The first one that came through, Rusty, is what is NSIP?
Well, that's a great place to start. So I think that's what we'll do there. So yeah, I've got a couple slides here put together just to kind of go over the first basics of NSIP. So I don't want this to be an hour-long lecture here, so I'm not going to be going off these slides too much, but I got 3 or 4 here to kind of get us started off. So NSIP is basically, well, it stands for the National Sheep Improvement Program. And all NSIP is we're a group, a nonprofit organization, group of sheep producers throughout the United States that are trying to make some progress on genetic selection. Listen, our slogan is that we're a profit-driven genetic selection tool, but we're a nonprofit group ourselves, so we're not making millions of bucks out here. I'm not driving a new pickup every year. What we get in membership fees gets invested right back into the program, so we can kind of keep moving things forward. Okay? So we're a profit-driven genetic selection tool. We're here to help make U.S. sheep producers more profitable in their endeavors through genetic selection. We do that by hopefully fulfilling our mission, which is simply to provide these predictable, economically important genetic evaluation tools to the U.S. sheep industry. So we simply take performance information from you all in the sheep industry, and we run it through statistical analysis, and we return back to you these tools called estimated breeding values that you can use in your decision-making processes. So just a couple more pictures here to kind of help drive that point home. why a tool like NSIP is important is because when we're trying to make genetic selection tools, the tried and true method, the way we've been selecting sheep and been selecting goats for the last 1,000 years or so, is by looking at our sheep. Okay, so I got a nice looking polypay ram up there. He's a darn good sheep. Most of my ewes actually stem from this ram right here. He's a good ram. Looking at him, you can tell he's a pretty decent ram. But when you're looking at this sheep, on average, 80% of what you're looking at is due to the environment that that ram was raised in. Okay, when you're buying a ram or you're buying a buck, you're buying mostly the environment that that animal was raised in. Okay, but when we're interested in him as a breeding animal, okay, they don't pass on all those environmental differences. They don't pass on that 80% that you can see. Okay, it's that 20% that you can't see that's controlled by genetics. That's what gets passed on to the next generation. That's what makes up your next crop of ewe lambs. That's what makes up your next crop of doelings. Okay, that's what we need to try to focus on. We need to try to find ways to quantify that genetic value and make educated selection decisions based on that. Okay, so this 80%, that's an average. This is the concept of heritability. We know that some traits are more heritable than others. All that gets factored into the estimated breeding value calculation. It's not going to get too in-depth into the woods, but all in a nutshell is we're going to take certain performance information traits from these animals, things like body weights, things like fleece traits and carcass ultrasounds. We're going to collect that data, send it in for analysis, and at the end of the day, this is what gets returned back to producers, members of NSIP. Okay? This is the bread and butter of NSIP. This is what we do. We take that information and turn it into these things called estimated breeding values. Okay? So you can see here, we have an ID number over here on the left-hand side. We have a 16-digit identification number, and we have all these abbreviations across the top, which we'll get into in a second. And down below those, we have the actual estimated breeding values. Okay? So what is an estimated breeding value? Okay? An EBV is simply quantifying the genetic merit of a sheep for a particular trait at a particular age period. Okay? So it's a number value that is assigned to the genetic merit or genetic value of that animal. Okay? So let's just go through an example here to kind of illustrate that. So what we have here is we have a WWT, so we have a weaning weight estimated breeding value. In this particular example, this animal has a 3.0 for weaning weight. Okay, so what that means is that this particular animal has the genetic potential to be 3 kilograms heavier at weaning time than the average of that breed. Okay, so based on genetics alone, it's got the genetic potential to be 3 kilograms heavier at weaning time than the average of that breed. Okay. That makes sense, Callie?
Yep, makes total sense.
Good.
Now they just have to convert those into pounds.
Oh, that's going to be our next step.
Okay, perfect.
We're going to take a little bit of an algebra lesson here. Okay. So you mentioned you picked up on the fact that it's in kilograms. Okay. So we're going to convert that to pounds. We're also going to do another step of mathematics here as well, though. Okay. So I said that this is our individual ram's genetic potential for weaning weight. Okay. But I really don't care what my ram's genetic potential is. Okay. He's a small part of my flock. I care about what his lambs are going to do. Okay. So our first set of mathematics is that when this ram sires lambs at my operation, those lambs inherit half of their genetics from that sire. Okay. So we're going to take this 3.0 and we're going to divide it by 2. Okay. So we'd expect his lambs to have the genetic potential to be 1.5 kilograms heavier at weaning time than the average of that breed. With me?
Got it.
All right. One more step of mathematics, though.
All right.
Okay. So we just cut that number by 2, divided that by 2 to figure out what his lambs are going to do. Okay. But as you mentioned, we are one of 3 countries in the world that don't use the metric system. I don't really use kilograms on a daily basis. I like to think in terms of pounds. Okay. There's 2.2 pounds per kilogram. You don't need to really know that because we just divided this number by 2. We're going to multiply it by 2.2 to get back to pounds. Essentially, forget all that algebra and just know that his lambs have the genetic potential to be about 3 pounds heavier at weaning time than the average of that breed.
Perfect.
Okay. Easy mathematics.
Easy.
Easy. Okay? So we have that a weaning weight example here. And one important thing to mention at this point is that that is the lamb's genetic potential. Okay? Now, whether or not that lamb expresses that genetic potential, that's up to you all as the sheep producers. Okay? Because we know that every animal, the actual performance of that animal is a combination of both its genetics and the environment that it was raised in. Okay? We need to have both pieces of that to raise a successful lamb or kid crop. Okay? As a nutritionist by training, I can't let that part go. We still need to have that management side. We need to give those lambs or kids the opportunity to express those genetics to be profitable for us. One of my old mentors used to tell me is that you can't feed your way out of poor genetics, but you can starve yourselves out of good ones.
Yep.
Okay? So if you don't have that genetic potential there, it doesn't matter how well you feed them, they're never going to outperform that genetic potential. On the other side, you can have the greatest genetic potential in the world, but if they're out there grazing on nothing but Canada thistle, they're not going to express that genetic potential. Okay, so we need to have both aspects to it. Another kind of analogy I like to use is, if you have, say, a high-performing Corvette race car, okay, got great potential there. If you put watered down diesel fuel in that Corvette, you're going to get pretty crummy performance. On the other side, if you have a little pedal moped, you can put high octane racing fuel in it. You're still riding around on a moped. Okay? So we need to have both components here. Okay? And we also need to make sure we're matching up our genetic potential with our management strategies. And I'll probably get into this as we get into further down the question list. But we need to make sure we're matching up the genotypes with the environment that we're able to provide to those lambs. Okay? So if I have an extensive grass-based operation with native range, unimproved pastures, it's probably not going to be worthwhile to me to be using the very high-end rams or high-end bucks because I'm not able to physically provide them with the environment to express that genetic potential. Okay? There's some, you can have the greatest, say, number of lambs born estimated breeding value. But if you're not able to provide them with the nutrients to express that, it's kind of all waste. So that leads me to my next point. We talked about a weaning weight example. We've got all sorts of different estimated breeding values out there. We have them for body weights at different age time periods. We have them for reproduction. So this one right here on the example is number of lambs born. You also have a number of lambs weaned estimated breeding value. So this gives you an estimate of the reproductive performance of those ewes or does. So this example here has got a 12.7%. What that means is we expect this ram to sire daughters that'll drop 12.7% more lambs. Another way to think of that is if you get 100 daughters out of this ram, you can expect to get 12.7 more lambs out of that group of daughters. Okay? Since we can't get 0.7% of a lamb, we'll go ahead and drop it down. We'll say you'll get an extra 12 lambs out of those. Okay? Number of lambs weaned works the exact same way. If you have one that's 25, okay, you can expect those lambs to wean 25% more lambs than the base average of that breed. So the other kind of cool ones up here, let's go through maternal weaning weight as an example. So maternal weaning weight is a cool one. That is the genetic potential for the dam's contribution to weaning weight. Okay? So how much of a difference in weaning weight can we expect based on how good or how poor of a mother that dam was? Okay? Essentially, it's milk production. Okay? So this one right here is a 2.18. Okay? You would expect daughters out of this ram. The lambs out of those would be about 2 pounds heavier because they're being raised by better moms. Some other cool ones we got here. We have our carcass measurements here of fat and eye muscle. Okay, so we can have a genetic potential for muscling and fat deposition. This one right here happens to be a targee, so we have fleece information. Okay, so we have fiber diameter, we have grease fleece weight, we have staple length. If you're interested in fleece traits, there's a list of fleece traits as long as my arm. Okay, we can go with fleece weight, we can go with yield, curvature, coefficient of variation of fiber diameter, comfort factor, all sorts of cool things on the fiber side of things. Mm-hmm. So One last little point on this slide, and then we'll move on to my last one because I think it's going to lead into our next question, is for each of our breeds, we also have these things called production indexes. Okay? So what a production index does is it combines multiple traits into one easy to use number. So for this one, this is a Tardee, we have a US range index. Okay, so what US range index does is it combines the estimated breeding values for growth, for fleece, and for growth, fleece, and reproduction all into the same index, okay? And it weights those differently based on economics, and it gives you one easy to use number. Okay, so if you ever get confused about all these individual hieroglyphics up here, you can go to that index value and it'll combine all the economically important traits of that breed into one easy to use number. Okay? So for our Katahdins, for example, we have a USA hair index. So that's the production index for our hair breeds. That combines, again, the growth traits as well as our reproductive and maternal traits. Our maternal traits have a USA maternal, and our terminal sire breeds have the Carcass Plus index. Okay? That combines growth and muscling into one easy to use number. So we don't put a whole lot of emphasis on the maternal traits in that carcass, focusing on what is going to make money on those breeds.
So,
cover the basics.
Yeah, well, I got a question for you. So, if I'm looking at these numbers and I see a negative number, should I be worried? Like, or should I'm just going to want all positive numbers, right?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yes and no. Okay, we're going to cover that in a further slide here in a couple seconds. But bigger is not always better in these numbers. Okay. For some of these, for example, like our fat deposition, we want the negative number. Okay, we want, for the most part, on a terminal sire animal, we want less fat. Okay, especially if we're selling on the for the commercial markets, our conventional heavy-fed lambs. Might be a different story for our non-traditional lambs, but our heavier lambs, we want to have less fat deposition on those lambs, so a negative number is good. For a fleece animal like this one, fiber diameter is another one that comes to mind. Okay, we want finer fleeces on those animals, so I want a smaller number for fiber diameter. A big one that's gaining in popularity right now is our estimated breeding values for parasite resistance. So we have fecal egg count EBVs. That's one that we really want to have negative. Because our fecal egg count EBVs, those are representative of a % reduction in fecal eggs that are being shed. Okay? So if we have an animal that's a negative 75, that means that those lambs are going to be shedding, or they have the genetic potential to shed 75% fewer eggs than the base average of that breed. The bigger is not always better. And we get into some of the more detailed questions on how to use these numbers. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth.
Okay, perfect. Let's see, are you ready for the next one?
I think so.
Okay, all right. So what data is gathered and then how is it entered?
Yeah. So the data that's gathered, that's going to depend on a lot of different things. Okay? So first of all the data is going to be collected on your farm or on your ranch. Okay, so it's all on-farm testing. It's within your environment. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit about accounting for those environmental differences. Okay, but it's data that's collected on farm, on ranch, and your production systems. Okay, and I always tell people there's no measurements that are mandatory to be on NSIP. Okay, the data that you collect and have analyzed is going to depend on what is economically important to your operation, or what sort of things are you interested in making progress in genetic progress in. There's set age categories and measurement types, which I'll show you here on this next slide. I apologize, this next slide, it's a really big table, but we're gonna walk through it, okay? So please don't get overwhelmed on it, okay? So this is our data collection table through NSIP. Now, what we have here is we have age categories across the left-hand side here. We have the associated age range that goes with those age categories. And then we have measurement types across the top here. Okay, so we have body weights, we have carcass ultrasound, fleece traits, scrotal circumference, and we have worm egg counts, or our parasite resistance traits. Okay? And as we go down through here, if one of these cells has the word yes in it, that means that there's an estimated breeding value for that measurement type age category combination. Okay? So if you're interested in looking at eye muscle at the post-weaning time period, you look in that cell, then yes, there's an EBV that's available for that. Or if I'm interested in fiber diameter at the yearling time period, we can look at this and we see that we do have an estimated breeding value available for that time period. Okay? A couple things on this. First is I said we have an age range that's corresponding with an age category, okay, or a name for that age category. Now that doesn't mean that you have to fall into this system to be a part of NSIP. So for, I'll take a step back here. For weaning, for example, our typical weaning range is between 42 and 90 days of age. But a lot of folks that are more extensively managed or grass-based operations, they're not weaning prior to 90 days. Okay? That's not that big of a deal. Okay? We can deal with that. We really don't care what that age category is called. Okay? What we really care about is this age range. Okay? So if you don't wean until 120 days, we can still weigh those lambs at weaning time at 120 days of age. We're just going to go ahead and put that weight into this early post-weaning category instead of putting it into the weaning category. Okay. So to manage all this data, when members sign up for NSIP, we provide a software program called Pedigree Master to all of our members. Okay. And that's a system that's just designed to manage data like this for estimated breeding value calculations. Okay. And we also send you instructions on how to deal with all that. If you're interested in it, NSIP has a YouTube channel, and I've got lots of different tutorial videos on how to use that software program that'll kind of walk you through all this on how to do it all. Okay, but as I said before, there's no measurement types that are mandatory. So just because this says yes in all these cells doesn't mean that NSIP members have to collect all this data. Okay? And again, what I always tell people is collect whatever's important to your operation. Okay? For example, if you're raising hair sheep, we're not going to be interested in fleece traits. Okay, so we're not going to be dealing with any of that stuff. Or if we raise all our sheep or our lambs, they're always in confinement. Say our lambs never graze before they go to market. I'm not that interested in worm egg counts, so I'm not going to worry about that. Or if our lambs are going to slaughter before they reach 300 days of age, we're not going to be going out here. Okay? What most folks do in NSIP, it's pretty ubiquitous across all of our breeds. What most producers get would be they would collect a birth weight, most will take a weaning weight, and then most will take an early post-weaning weight. Okay? That's kind of the bare minimum of what most of our producers are doing. And then we add on extra things that are mostly breed specific on top of that. Okay? So most of our terminal sire breeds, they'll add on carcass ultrasound during this early post-weaning time period. Some of our hair sheep breeders, some of our Katahdin breeders are starting to get into the carcass ultrasound, but it's less popular with those breeds. Most of our maternal wool breeds, not many folks are using the carcass ultrasound for them, but if it is of interest to you, those EBVs are available, so you can take that. Okay? Most of our range type breeds, so our Rambouillets, Targhees, our Merinos, Columbias, most of those folks are getting fleece traits. Most of that consists of a grease fleece weight, a fiber diameter, and a staple length. Okay? But you can also take things like staple strength and all those other big long lists that we talked about. Those are all available. Again, none of them are mandatory, but that's what's available to you. Okay? We have to do this within limits a little bit, okay? Because you can be out there and you can collect weights on your sheep every 45 to 60 days and collect data, manage data until you're blue in the face. But for most of us, that's not economically practical. I mean, there's a cost to going out there and spending that much time in the corrals working your sheep. Okay? So it's all available, but there are kind of some set standards. And I do have, there's an SOP up on our website that kind of breaks it down by breed, what most folks are collecting within that time period. Okay? But say if you don't have a carcass ultrasound technician that's close to you, you're not interested in it, that's not going to be a hurdle that you have to overcome. That's not going to impede you from taking place in NSIP.
What are the benefits for a wool flock to be involved? And I think this was more a fiber-oriented person, not necessarily just a commercial wool sheep breed producer.
Sure. What I kind of call the non-traditional wool producers that aren't just putting together big lots of wool, selling it to the wool warehouses, and going from there. Yeah, so we can work with all breeds of sheep. There's no limit to the breed. We also work with goats as well. I don't know if you have any goat producers on here, but everything that we talk about, I focus mostly on sheep. Um, but everything that's available to the sheep is also available to our goat producers. Okay? So if you're a goat producer, every time I say sheep, ewe, ram, lamb, just think kid, doe, buck. Okay. So for our kind of our more of our non-traditional or our niche fiber producers, like I said, there's a list of fleece traits that are as long as your arm that you're interested in. If you're interested in as a fleece trait, there's a good chance we've got an EBV for that. Okay. Like I said, the big ones are going to be grease fleece weight, fiber diameter, staple length. We also have EBVs if you have the ability to collect yield data. I think a yield is a very important one, especially if you're doing more further processing on your own operation. I think yield is definitely something you want to be paying attention to. Comfort factor is a big one if you're into the making garments, especially if you are getting into that next of skin garment market. Comfort factor is a huge one. Staple strength, especially if you're trying to market more towards the hand spinner market. I think staple strength and staple length would be definite ones we'd want to be paying attention to. So those are all EBVs that are available to our producers. It'd be up to the producers, though. You have to collect all that information. If you're not able to collect a yield on those individual fleeces, or if you're not able to collect a staple strength, you're going to have to ship those samples off to a lab that's able to do those sorts of things. But we can't make something out of nothing. We need to have that data that's going into it. In one of the in Pedigree Master, when you validate your data before you analyze it, there's a little error message that pops up and says, validate your data. If you have rubbish in, you get rubbish out. Okay. So the analysis is only as good as the data that goes into it. So whatever data you're able to collect as a fleece producer, that's what we're going to be paying attention to.
Do you have a list on the website of where people can send to get their wool tested?
No, I don't, but that's a great idea.
Okay,
I know if you go to the ASI website, I know they have a list of service providers for wool labs. Yoko McCall was kind of the big one that a lot of folks utilized, but I know that's things are going to be changing there a little bit. I know a lot of folks are shipping samples off to New Zealand right now. I know they're back up and running after some COVID shutdowns. There are a couple state land-grant universities that have some wool testing labs. I know Montana State has one. Texas A&M has one. For some of your basic samples, I know there's a few universities. Like I know I believe the Hettinger Ag Research Station through North Dakota State University has an OFTA machine. So you can get the basic fiber profiles from your OFTA machines. There's a couple private producers and private service providers that have OFTA machines as well. So there's lots of different options out there. I think when we're talking about fiber animals, though, it's important to realize, though, that even though fleece is our #1 selection criteria, they're still sheep at the end of the day. So we still need to be paying attention to these other traits. We need to be paying attention to reproduction, especially if we're going to be grazing. We need to be paying attention to parasite resistance. So there's, as an animal scientist, there's very few instances where I can think of where single trait selection has ever really paid off. Single trait selection, from everything that I've learned, has pretty much always turned into a massive train wreck. So I think we need to be looking at our operations as a whole when we're utilizing these EBVs, which I think we'll talk about in a further question. But we need to take a kind of a systematic approach to utilizing these tools, not get so narrow-minded that we forget the fact that these are living, breathing sheep. We still have to take care of the animal if they're going to produce a fleece for us.
Are there advantages of participation for small flocks, let's say 30 or less?
Of course, yeah, that's a great question. I always get asked that. Is this applicable to large flocks and small flocks? So there is no size limit to participating in NSIP, and it's a give and take scenario. because this is all statistical analysis, the more data you have going into the system, the more accurate the analysis is going to be. When we're calculating these estimated breeding values, you know, you as producers are sending us these data points. So you're sending me a weaning weight. And what we're trying to do with this evaluation is take that weaning weight, first figure out how different is it, and then try to figure out how much of that difference is genetics and how much of that is environment. Okay? So what we're trying to do at the end of the day is we're trying to parse out variation, okay, into genetics versus environment. And the more data we have, the more accurately we're able to do that. The more variation in performance we're able to account for. Okay? So the more data we have, the better that is. All that being said, there's lots of cool tools, and the analysis that these EBVs are run through is an extremely powerful statistical analysis, is that we can do that with these really awesome tools on smaller numbers of animals. Okay? So the average flock size in NSIP is right around 30 head. Okay? So it's kind of a common misconception that most NSIP flocks are these big, massive flocks. I lambed out 20 ewes this past year, and I got EBVs back on all my sheep. Okay? Now, there's a couple little caveats to that. One of the kind of ways to get around having a smaller flock is to be utilizing sheep that are already proven in the NSIP system. Okay? So what I did is when I started my own personal flock is I started with ewe lambs that were from a long-standing NSIP flock. Okay? And what that means is that if I take a step back here, when those animals were first born, that original flock assigned them this 16-digit NSIP ID number, okay? And that ID number follows that sheep no matter where it goes throughout the system, okay? And all the data for that animal is tied to that ID number, okay? So when I started my flock, even I started with 6 ewes. I started with 6 ewes from a proven flock that had a whole bunch of data coming in from behind them. Okay. I also bought a proven ram from another NSIP flock that had a whole bunch of data coming in behind him. Okay. Now, I know that's not possible for a lot of folks. I'm not saying go out and depopulate your flock and start from scratch. Okay. But what I'm saying is even if you have a smaller flock of 5, 10 ewes, you know, in 1 year, you can make a lot of genetic progress, a lot of progress on your data if you would utilize a proven NSIP ram that's been used in another flock. There has a whole lot of data coming behind them. Okay? That data follows that animal no matter where it comes from. Okay? So that's one way to get around that. So we have, I think our smallest flock is about 5 or 6 ewes. Our largest flock, they have about 10,000 sheep total. They submit data on about 2,500 every year as their kind of core nucleus flock. So we can deal with anybody and everybody in between there. There's some ways that we need to kind of manage that data to make it the best that it possibly can be, but there is no size limit.
Your data also gets better as you do it every year, right? Because then it's just adding on to that amount of data that you have, right?
Exactly. Yep. So we're adding to your own personal data set every single year that you submit data on them. And we also have a cool thing that when you submit, say you enroll in NSIP right now, and say you've got 20 years worth of historic data, you get to enter in all that historic data for free. Okay. So you can add in all that data. You can build the accuracy of your numbers and not get billed for all that old historic data. Okay. So there's a couple ways that we can get around having a smaller flock. Like I said, the best way is if you can utilize, say, a breeding ram from somebody else, even if it's a ram lamb, even if he's not a proven breeder himself, just the fact that he came from an NSIP flock can really help you out. And there's a lot of breeders that, proven NSIP breeders that have been in this for 25, 30 years that realize that it can be a little bit daunting to start from scratch joining NSIP. So they'll let you rent a ram for a year, lease a ram for a year, or they'll swap rams with you for a year. Okay? That's a cool scenario because then you're taking a ram from their operation, utilizing it at your premises, and they're taking a ram from your place and using it at their premises. That's something I didn't talk about yet, but I'll touch on it now, is we have these things called genetic linkages that help with our cross-flock evaluations. So when NSIP first started, we had within flock evaluations. So my estimated breeding values were only comparable within my flock. When we made some changes to the analysis back in 2010, we partnered up with Sheep Genetics Australia. The Australians, they got a ton more sheep than we have. They have a ton more research and development dollars than we have. So they built this really cool, it's the biggest, strongest, most robust genetic evaluation for sheep in the entire world. They built that, and NSIP partnered with Lamb Plan, Sheep Genetics Australia in 2010. So now we have access to that really cool tool. With that transition, or with that partnership, we were able to get cross-flock evaluations through genetic linkages. So in that scenario I just talked about, if I'm taking genetics from an outside flock, bringing them to my premises, what we're then doing is we're testing a different genetic line in a different environment, and that helps us to figure out what differences in performance are genetics versus environment. So we take, through these genetic linkages, say you've got a flock there in Kentucky, Kelly, and I take a ram from you and I breed them to my ewes. I've just linked our flocks together genetically.
Sure.
But say you've got a ram from a producer up in Ohio. Okay. I, through you, am also connected to that flock there in Ohio. So what we have is we have this huge, great big net of these genetic connections where we're testing all these different genetic lines in all these different environments. And that's helping us to account for these variations. And the resulting EBVs then, these are true genetic potentials regardless of environment. Okay? Because what that does is say, I raise my sheep largely in confinement here in Iowa because I'm surrounded by cornfields and grass is kind of hard to come by. That's a completely different environment to someone that's maybe grazing reclaimed strip mine ground with nothing but tall fescue in Kentucky. Okay? Through those genetic linkages, we're able to account for those differences in environment, okay? And we're still able to express that genetic potential. Okay? Those animals have the same genetic potential regardless of environment that they go across, and those genetic linkages help us to account for that. That makes sense? We're getting a little complicated, a little technical.
No, I'm tracking with you. Okay, now you also have you also connected with the GOAT plan too from Australia and New Zealand, right?
Yes. So the GOAT evaluation, so our sheep evaluation, they're running the evaluation called Lamb Plan. All the GOAT evaluation, they're an evaluation called Kid Plan. So those are different evaluations under the big Sheep Genetics Australia umbrella.
Well, that kind of leads into the next question, which is how do I improve my goat herd?
Yeah, so how do you improve your goat herd? How do you actually utilize this to make genetic progress?
Yeah.
And that's a great question because, all this data, it's all fine and dandy, but if we don't utilize it to make progress, it's all for naught. Okay, it's all kind of a waste. Excuse me. Okay, so just like the estimated breeding values that are available to you, it all depends on what's important to your evaluation or what's important to your operation. Okay, so to actually utilize these things, we need to sit down and we need to think about what's important to my operation, what makes me money, okay, or what keeps my ewes or my does healthier. Okay, and that's something that's independent. That's something that is individual for every single producer. Okay, what works for me in Iowa is not going to work for you out in Kentucky and vice versa. Okay. And that's, I think, one of the beauties of our industries is that we have a lot of diversity in our sheep and goat industries. Because our animals are so adaptable, we can raise them in all 50 states. We can do it in a lot of different management strategies. Okay? And we can all be successful at it. So utilizing these tools, we're going to do it in different ways. So I'm going to skip ahead a few slides here, okay? Because I got a couple tools that can kind of help out with these decisions. Okay? What I always say is we need to focus on the genetic traits that are going to be the most impactful to our operations. Okay? What's going to make us the most money? Because I showed you there's a big long list of EBVs for every animal within this evaluation. But we know from Genetics 101 course I took in college that the more traits I select for at one time, the slower my overall progress is going to be. Okay? Versus if I focus on 2 or 3 economically important traits, I can make faster genetic progress in those over time. Okay? Now, I'm not saying, again, like I said before, single trait selection has never worked throughout all of animal breeding, from what I can tell. Okay, so we still need to be selecting balanced animals, but we can place more emphasis on economically important traits. Okay? For commercial sheep producers, the commercial sheep producer that's selling fed lambs or selling feeder lambs on the commercial market, and it's pretty ubiquitous across the sheep and goat industries. Profitability is usually determined by pounds of lamb weaned per ewe exposed. Okay? So pounds of lamb weaned per ewe exposed is a calculation that most of us can kind of base our decisions on, trying to maximize. So what goes into that calculation of pounds of lambs weaned per ewe exposed? Well, first, it's going to be number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, and then the weights, weaning weights of those lambs. Okay? So for most commercial sheep producers, I think most of our emphasis should be placed on those 3 traits. Not saying that these other traits aren't important, but I think we should put our most emphasis on those 3 traits. Okay? If we're going to be raising sheep, especially for you folks in the Southeast, in a hot, humid climate where internal parasites are a big important factor, I think that should be pretty high up on people's priority list, these parasite-resistant estimated breeding values. Okay? And if you're solely grass-based, no concentrates or anything like that, this might be your top priority. That might be the thing you need to work on the most. Okay? So it's all going to depend on your operation. We have this thing called the RAM Buying Guide that you can find up on our NSIP website. This is just one particular page or an example out of that walks you through the process of utilizing these tools to make genetic progress. So what I usually tell folks is, first step is write down what your current production levels are. Okay, just write down what your lambing rate is, what's your weaning rate, what's your average weaning rate. If you're raising terminal sires or selling lambs on a contract basis through a packer, what are your oini areas or your back fat thicknesses? How many times do you have to drench your lambs or your ewes every year? Okay, so write down what you're currently at. Then you write down what your goal is. Okay, so this is where I am, this is where I want to be. After we've set what those goals are, then we can start to put some priorities on our genetic selection. Okay? As I said before, there's a couple different ways to set that priority level. First, I would say, is place the most priority on what's going to either have the most economic impact on your operation, or what area do you need to make the most improvement on? Where's the biggest difference between your current level and your production goal? Okay? From that, we can then set some thresholds for these estimated breeding values to actually make some progress on. Okay? So I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to go back one slide. Again, this is a very busy slide, but it'll make sense here in just a second, because we need to have some benchmarks to compare these estimated breeding values to. Okay, we need to know, okay, so is that 3.0 weaning weight EBV, is that good or is that bad? Okay. And that comes into play here. When I'm placing emphasis, I need to know what is a top 10% EBV for parasite resistance. Okay, so to know that, we need to have a percentile report or a scorecard. Okay, so again, this is a really busy slide, but there's a lot of information that we can get out of this that we'll walk through here. And we'll make it all make sense. Okay, so here I just pulled up a polypay percentile report that I just ran last week, I think. Okay, so this is the estimated breeding value scorecard for the polypay breed as of the evaluation run 2 weeks ago. So across the top here, we have all of our different estimated breeding values that are mostly important to our polypay breeds. Okay. Again, we have other EBVs available to them, but this is what most polypay breeders are paying attention to. We have birth weight, we have maternal birth weight, maternal weaning weight, post-weaning weight. We have our parasite resistance, we have weaning fecal egg count, post-weaning fecal egg count, number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, and then we have the index. Okay, so a lot of different EBVs. And across the side here, we have the percentile band within this entire population. Okay, so we'll make sense of this here in just a second. So in total, right now we have estimated breeding values on 93,844 polypay sheep. Okay? So big wide net there of sheep to be picking through. Okay? We're going to narrow this down a little bit because if I'm interested in buying a ram lamb, I want to make a little bit smaller pool to be choosing from. Okay? So what was recorded just in the last 2 lambing seasons, so in the 2019-2020 lamb crops, we had data collected and EBVs returned on a little bit less than 7,000 animals. Okay. Of those about 7,000, about 6,400 of them are alive, okay, and have EBVs on them still. And then I break it down into ram lambs and ewe lambs here. Okay. So these are what this population, what these percentile reports are going to be calculated on. So this is a percentile breakdown of those of 6,404 current polypay lambs with EBVs. Okay? And this is the percentile ranking. So let's go with our weaning weight example. So if I have a polypay ram lamb that has a 2.85 weaning weight EBV, that puts that animal in the 98th percentile. Okay, so it puts it in the top 2% of the breed for that particular trait. Okay, that makes sense?
Yeah, so now all the algebra we went through has already been applied, right? When you're looking at these numbers, you don't have to do all that. Okay, good.
Yeah, you don't have to do any of that. All the algebra has been applied.
Okay, perfect.
So right here towards the bottom third of the screen, I have it highlighted. This is the current breed average, or the 50th percentile. Okay. So the current breed average weaning weight EBV is 1.34. Okay. So that brings up what is the base average, okay? Because we know, just we'll take a population genetics lesson here. Okay, if I look at a large population of animals, if we simply calculate an average of that population of animals, we're going to have half our animals above average, half our animals below average. Okay, when we're doing our EBVs, we're going to have that same distribution. We're going to have half the animals above average, half the animals below average. Okay, so that for the first year of that evaluation, that average was 0 for all the different traits. So the average EBV was 0 across the board. Okay? But if we're going to measure genetic progress from year to year, we need to keep that base average 0 in that initial year. Okay? So our current breed average is 1.34. So that's the genetic progress the polypay breed as a whole has made since that original year with lamb plan. Okay? So that's why our average right now is not 0 across the board. Okay? There's an interesting one here, though, if we look at our fecal egg count EBVs for polypays. So these EBVs have really only gained popularity in the polypay breed in the last 2 years. So we really didn't make much genetic progress in that particular trait compared to our other traits. So looking at like number of lambs weaned, we've made a 19% increase as a breed since the beginning of that trait, back when we partnered up with Lamb Plan in 2010. Okay, so the entire polypay breed on NSIP has increased number of lambs weaned by 19%. Look at the fecal egg counts. Since those EBVs weren't available to them, we really didn't make any genetic progress. Okay, so that average is still really close to that original base back in 2010. So it's kind of an interesting little thing there on how the data works. But just going through a few of these examples. As a polypay breeder, the big ones I'm interested in as the maternal breed are number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned. Okay? So that's where I'm personally going to place the largest emphasis in selection pressure. Okay? So I want to pick, say, an animal that's in the top 10% of the breed for number of lambs weaned. I'm going to come here to the 90th percentile. I'm going to come across the number of lambs weaned, and then I see a 29.1. Okay? So if I'm interested in a ram, if he doesn't have a 29.1 or higher, he's not going to meet my criteria. I'm not going to look at him. Okay? If I'm looking at, say, I want to buy a Hampshire ram to put on my polypay ewes. Okay, he's a terminal sire. I'm going to ship all those lambs to market. I really don't care what his number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned are. It doesn't make a darn bit of difference to me. What I care about for him is going to be his weaning weight, his post-weaning weight. If I'm selling on a contract basis, I'd be interested in his carcass measurements as well. But for the most part, most of us sell pounds of live weight at the sale barn or to a buyer. That's what most of us are going to be paying attention to, are these growth traits, weaning weight and post-weaning weight. Okay? So that's how I'm going to make actual progress. I'm going to place selection pressure on the traits that are economically important to me, and I'm also going to be looking at a benchmark. Okay? Just because an animal has an estimated breeding value doesn't mean it's a good one. Okay, that's a lot of misconception I hear all the time. Is a lot of people think, oh, I joined NSIP, I've got EBVs, my sheep are rock stars. I can tell you firsthand, I've got some sheep that have some pretty poor EBVs on them. Okay, it does not mean to make them good. All those EBV tells you is how good or how poor your sheep are. It's up to you as the shepherd or as the flock manager to actually use those tools to make genetic progress. And kind of getting back to your question of, is bigger always going to be better? I'll just give you a personal example in how I raise my sheep. That bigger is certainly not always better. My personal example is, again, I raise polypace. I do raise my sheep on grass for the most part. My ewe flock grazes through a good part of the year. I have them in dry lots for about 4 months out of the year, just because there's no grass available, no corn stalks available to graze them on. Because I spend a lot of time on the road with my position with NSIP, I try to raise them as extensively and as cheaply as possible, which is really contrary to how a lot of my colleagues here in Iowa raise them. Okay? A lot of my neighbors, their sheep are in confinement 365 days a year. Okay? They're accelerated lambing, so they're lambing those ewes, most of them 3 times in 2 years. So they're lambing every 8 months. Okay, and their main objective is to crank out the lambs. They want as many lambs born as they possibly can. They've got really great orphan lamb raising setups. So they'll just, if they can get twins, triplets, quads, that's what they want. Okay? When I'm gone, okay, if I want to stay married, I can't have that many bottle lambs. Okay, my wife is a professor up at Iowa State University. We got that 2-year-old son. She's got her hands full when I'm out of town, just doing basic chores. She doesn't have time to mix up milk replacer. Okay, so I'm willing to sacrifice lamb drop a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to focus on having ewes that are going to raise the lambs that they have. Okay, so what's more important to me than an overall number of lambs born or number of lambs weaned EBV is I look at the ratio of their number of lambs weaned EBV relative to their number of lambs born. Okay, so this might get a little confusing, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time because this is a hard one to wrap your head around. It took me a long time to figure this out. Okay, but my criteria is I want their number of lambs weaned estimated breeding value to be at least 3 times as high as their number of lambs born EBV. Okay, so if I have a number of lambs born EBV of 5, their number of lambs weaned EBV has to be at least 15. Okay, so I'm sure everyone's asking yourself, how can you wean more lambs than you have born? Okay, that's a perfectly logical question. It took me a long time to figure this out, but we need to realize that those 2 traits are analyzed independently of each other. Okay, and we need to look at what are the units on those EBVs. Okay. So again, number of lambs born is reported as a percentage. Okay, so we expect a ewe that has an 11.9 or say a 12 has a 12% EBV. They're going to drop 12% more lambs relative to the average of that breed. Okay, weaned, okay, number of lambs weaned EBV is they're going to wean 19% more than the average of that breed. Okay, just looking at the 50th percentile here. Okay, so it doesn't matter how many they were born, it's what percentage of those lambs they're weaning relative to the average of that breed. So those are analyzed independent of each other. Okay, so you can have a really high number of lambs born. You can have a 61.6 here, and they can be weaning a small percentage of them and be down at a 14.1 here. Okay, or you can be like my operation. Like I said, I sacrifice drop a little bit. A lot of my neighbors, they're dropping 280% lamb drop on their polypace. I'm willing to drop that back a little bit to 240%, making sure those ewes raise the lambs that they drop. Okay, So I'm not looking for bigger is always better. I'm looking for this relative to this. And then my second criteria, it's almost as important as the first one, is the maternal weaning weight. Okay, so the dam's contribution to weaning weight or milk production. Okay, again, I want those ewes to raise the lambs that they have. I want as much milk as I can possibly get. So I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on this maternal weaning weight. And again, every operation is different. If you're raising your sheep a little bit differently, so I've got some friends of mine that are 100% grass-based. Their sheep never see grain. Parasite resistance is a big point of emphasis for them. So they'll look at, if they don't have a sheep that's negative 60 or so for post-weaning fecal egg count, they won't even look at them, no matter what their number lambs born, number lambs weaned are.
So if we could go back just a little bit and talk about how do I use NSIP to choose a ram for a terminal cross breeding in the production of market lambs, which is exactly the scenario that you just gave. But I have a question first. So when you flip back to your chart about how to choose your priorities, if you have not been keeping track of this data already, does it do you any good to go on an NSIP sale and look at these numbers and say, yeah, I'm going to buy this one, if you don't really know where you're currently at right now?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's good motivation to start collecting that data if you're not currently doing it. I think regardless of the size or focus of our operation, even if we have a small flock and it's just a hobby to keep the kids out of trouble, it's still great if that hobby can pay for itself. Ideally, make a little bit of money. Okay, and we can't really know that if we're not collecting some of this data. If we're not collecting some of this baseline data. I think at least at a bare minimum, everyone should be able to record first if a ewe has a lamb or not for that year. If you have a non-productive animal, outside of that animal being a pet, which there's nothing wrong with that animal being a pet, but if it's a hobby that you're halfway serious about, you might consider sending that animal down the road. It can go be a pet for somebody else, but your hobby is not going to be a hobby very long if it loses you a lot of money. Okay? So should be motivation to be collecting some bare bones data, whether they lambed or not, how many or how long of a breeding season you needed to get that ewe bred. So just writing down on the calendar when you put the ram or the buck in, when you pulled them out, and then later on you look at lambing dates relative to those dates. Did they breed towards the beginning of the season? Did they breed towards the end of the season? I know not everyone has a scale at home, but if you have a scale, I think it's great if you can get a weaning weight, or if you ship fed lambs to get a finished weight, right? Whatever the endpoint of those animals are for your operation, get a weight on that so you can start measuring it and know if you need to you should be making some progress or not. Right? If you don't have any of that information and you still want to be maybe try to utilize these EBVs, I'd say go back to this percentile report.
Yep.
Okay, and kind of compare things to this 50th percentile. Okay, I would start with this USA maternal index over here. Okay, and I would say for the most part, if you can get an animal that is above the 50th percentile or above breed average, okay, you're taking a step in the right direction. Okay? So if you're looking for a polypay ram, choose one that's 111 for USA maternal index or higher. Okay? That's a great first step. Just look at that number if you get confused by all the rest of it. Okay? Yeah. Then as you start to make a little progress, you start to understand a little bit more, then you can go back to that sheet. You can say, okay, this is where I want to place the most emphasis. Okay? Even without that data, you can say, I'm drenching my sheep way too much, or my ewes are way too thin. I've got some really pale eyelids. I need to make some progress in fecal egg counts. I'm going to look in the top 20% of the breed for weaning fecal egg count and post-weaning fecal egg count.
And like you said, that terminal cross, you're going to be looking more at your weaning weights and your post-weaning weights, right?
Exactly, yeah. So for a terminal cross, it's all going to depend on how you're selling your sheep. Like I said, if you're selling on the traditional market, what I call the traditional commercial market, you're selling either feeder lambs that are going to a feedlot to be finished to a heavier weight, or you're finishing those lambs yourself and selling them, I would say above 130 pounds to a packer or to a buyer, we need to look at how we're getting paid on those. The vast majority of sheep producers, you get paid on pounds of lamb that gets on that truck. Okay? That's just the fact of the matter of the world we live in right now. Okay, so if I'm selling feeder lambs right off the ewes, I'm going to be put most of my emphasis on weaning weight. If I'm going to hold on to those lambs and I'm going to finish them myself, I've got some feed on hand, I'm going to finish them myself, take advantage of that. I'm going to focus on post-weaning weight. Now, if I'm selling on a grid or if I have a contract and I'm getting paid on carcass quality, I'm definitely going to be looking at post-weaning fat deposition, and I'm going to be looking at post-weaning eye muscle, because I'm going to be getting a premium for high quality or high yielding carcasses, or I'm going to be getting a discount on these poor conformation carcasses. Even if you're not getting premiums based on eye muscle or composition like that, excuse me, if you're selling on a carcass weight basis, there is a correlation between muscling and dressing percentage. So you might want to put some emphasis on eye muscle at that point. If you can increase eye muscle, and really if you can increase fat for that matter, you can increase your dressing percentage. So you're increasing your pay weight that you're going to be getting paid on if you're selling on a carcass basis. There's been a couple more of informal studies that have looked at the live conformation of those animals as they're going through a sale barn. And there's been some extension type publications that have shown about a 5% increase on sale price for those heavier muscled lambs. So just those lambs have a more attractive appearance. Buyers are willing to spend a little bit more for those lambs. So even if you're selling just based on weight alone, you might want to think about looking at those carcass numbers as well. That gets me back to my point of no matter what our goals are, we still need to be looking at a well-rounded, balanced sheep. Again, single trait selection has never ended well. If we select just based on post-weaning weight, we're going to fall into the trap that the cattle folks fell into over the last couple of decades. We're going to get bigger and bigger and bigger mature sheep. Okay? As a sheep shearer who shears between 8,000 and 10,000 sheep a year, I see this on a yearly basis. Our sheep are getting really big. Yeah. Okay? As we get our sheep bigger, we get our shearers upset with us, first of all. We also increase our maintenance costs. Okay? Those sheep need to physically eat more just to maintain their body tissues. Okay? I'm not saying big sheep are a bad thing. Okay? If we have a big sheep that's also productive, okay, I'm all for that. But we need to be making sure they're productive sheep. And back to my original point, if we just do single trait selection, we're going to sacrifice something else somewhere. Okay? In my polypace, for example, you can see it. If you select strictly on number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, okay, we're actually selecting for a smaller type sheep that expresses more of the fin component to polypace. Okay? And I'm going to be sacrificing other areas of my production. Okay? Polypays, if you're not familiar with them, they're a composite breed. They're a quarter fin, quarter Dorset, quarter Targhee, and quarter Rambouillet. And you can really see it as you start examining these numbers. Those sheep that have these really high number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned EBVs typically exhibit more of those fin type characteristics. Not saying that's a bad thing, that's just a different type of sheep than some people are looking for. That being said as well, going back to the balance issue, these numbers are all fine and dandy, but we still have to look at our sheep to be making selection decisions. Okay, we cannot select breeding sheep just based on these numbers in front of us. That's going to lead to a big, massive train wreck in a pretty short period of time. We still have to look for those sheep. They still have to be sound on their feet and legs. They still have to get out, cover country. Okay, they still have to have a good mouth structure on them. If we're raising registered sheep, we still have to be raising sheep to meet our breed standards. Right? Those are things that the EBVs aren't going to tell us. That's where we have to take a step back, get off the computer, go out and look at the sheep. Okay? There's a couple of different schools of thought on that. There's a couple of different ways to do it. And I tell you, my personal preference is I go back and forth on it. First of all, when I'm making selection decisions on which ewe lambs I'm going to keep, my first calling decision. Well, first, my philosophy is I like to call very heavily. Again, I don't like problems in my operation just on how I raise my sheep. They need to be pretty self-sufficient. They got to be on their own. So my first calling decisions are on my lambing records. If there was a problem in the lambing shed, if there was a poor mother or something like that, that sheep is automatically called. No ifs, ands, or buts. Don't pass go. Don't collect $200. It gets on the truck at weaning time. I don't want to deal with it. Okay. Then I take a look at my estimated breeding values, and I set myself some thresholds based on these percentile reports. Okay. So a ewe lamb has to be in the top 40% of the breed for number of lambs weaned for me to look at her. Okay. I make those cuts based on paper here, and then I take that paper and I go out to the barn. Okay. Then I look at those sheep and I say, okay, well, this ewe right here, she's got great numbers, but she is pigeon-toed and sickle-hocked and parrot-mouthed. I don't care how good a number she has. She can be the top ewe in the country. She's going on a truck down the road. Okay. You can do it the other way around too. You can make your first selection decisions out in the barn, and you can find, say I need to select 10 replacement ewe lambs. I'm going to pick 20 that meet my standards based on what I see out in the barn. Then I can come back in the office and make my final cuts based on those numbers that I see in front of me. Okay? But it has to be a balance. They can't be, the numbers are not our end all be all when it comes to genetic selection.
Right. We just like to have pretty looking sheep.
There's nothing wrong with pretty looking sheep. Okay. But I want pretty looking sheep that are going to be nice and productive for me as well.
Yep,
okay?
Absolutely.
You know, I have neighbors and I have pride. I don't want to have a really productive sheep that I don't want to take out of the back 40 just because I'm too embarrassed to show her.
Do you only enter registered sheep in the NSIP?
Fantastic question.
Yep.
While the majority of the sheep on NSIP are registered, there is no requirement to be registered, to be on NSIP. We want this to be a tool that's accessible to the entire sheep industry, regardless of whether you register or not. So it's open to absolutely everybody. We do have a couple NSIP ram sales. So that would be one area where, in order to participate in that, in one of those particular sales, those sheep have to be registered or able to be registered. There are other sales where you don't have to be registered for, but for our Center of the Nation NSIP sale we have here in Spencer, Iowa every year, that's one of the requirements of that sales, they have to be registered. That's how the only little caveat. Again, there's other sales, there's online sales that NSIP hosts that we don't have to be registered. That's a decision that's up to you.
Let's say I have a commercial flock and I want to get into it. How do I determine where it's going to go? Is it going to, let's say I have a polypay, Suffolk, something else cross. Where does it get determined? Where do those percentages end up on a percentile report?
Yeah, so that gets a little bit tricky there. And maybe we have a difference in vocabulary on registered versus non, or commercial versus non. And as of right now, our evaluations are breed specific. Sorry, evaluations are within a breed. Okay? We can handle crossbred sheep, and that's something that we're working on right now, trying to figure out better ways to do it. But for the most part, the vast majority of sheep in NSIP are purebred sheep. Okay? Now, whether they're registered or not, and you could also argue if there is a thing as a purebred sheep in the U.S. But our evaluations are within breed, and the vast majority of our sheep are purebred sheep. Okay? Again, they don't have to be registered, but they have to be within that breed. We do have crossbreds on NSIP. Okay, so we have, we'll say, polypay Dorset cross. Okay, when we have that situation, I've got someone who does that. We have to make a decision: do we want to put those in the polypay evaluation, or do we want to put those in the Dorset evaluation? Okay. I said, not saying we can't handle it. We can get you EBVs on those animals, on those crossbreds. We just have to figure out what animals we're going to compare to. So if you're trying to compare to a purebred polypay, we'll say, okay, we'll put them in the polypay evaluation. That's what we're going to compare it to. Okay. I didn't talk about ID numbers very much, but there is, if you want to do crossbreds, I would ask you to put like an abbreviation in that ID number so that when I'm running these percentile reports, that I can take those animals out of the report. So I'm only comparing, or I'm only making these reports on purebred animals. Because we know those crossbred animals are going to be exhibiting some hybrid vigor. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I want to make sure that that hybrid vigor isn't artificially inflating these EBVs, and I'm making inaccurate comparisons. It's really not fair to a purebred polypay to compare to that crossbred on a genetic evaluation basis, especially when that in that next generation, that F2 cross, we're going to see a little bit of a dilution of that hybrid vigor.
Mm-hmm. But even like as a crossbred producer, it's still a benefit to participate in it because you're going to give me my data back on my flock. And then I'm going to come back and buy a purebred ram more than likely.
Right. So there's a couple different parts in there. It's one is this is open to all sheep breeders of all breeds, crossbreds, and everything. Okay? As I said, the majority of sheep that are in NSIP are purebreds, and it was really designed from the get-go that really we're not asking every sheep breeder in the United States to be a member of NSIP. Okay, we really are trying to focus on the seed stock producers to be a member of NSIP. And then as a commercial sheep producer, so when I say seed stock, I mean that your main business is selling breeding stock to other sheep producers. When I say commercial sheep producer, my version of that is your main goal is not selling breeding stock. Your main goal is selling lambs on the commercial market or selling non-traditional lambs. So the vast majority of your lamb crop goes to slaughter. Whether you're retaining your own replacements or not, that's up to you. But when I say commercial sheep producer, your main goal is selling lambs or selling wool. It's not selling breeding stock. In that scenario, I think you can get the biggest benefit from NSIP by utilizing these EBVs when you're purchasing seed stock. Okay? You yourself probably don't have to go through all the effort to collect this data and get these EBVs to reap the benefits of it. Okay? You can go to a seed stock provider that is getting the EBVs. You can pay them a little bit extra because you're going to reap the benefits from those EBVs, and they put some time and effort into getting those, and bring that seed stock back home to your place and reap all the benefits from it. Okay? Like I said, if you're a commercial producer and you see value in this, you're welcome to join NSIP. But that wasn't the original intent of it. And because there is a cost to be a member of NSIP, for the most part, you're more able to recoup the costs and be profitable if you're a seed stock producer. If you sign up and you're a commercial producer, yes, over time, you're going to increase your productivity of your flock. If you're using the EBVs in your decisions, okay, just because you sign up for NSIP doesn't mean you're going to be profitable. Okay? If you're utilizing the tools, how they were designed, okay, you can improve the productivity of your flock. You have the potential to increase profitability, but because there's that fee involved, you're most likely not going to recover the full cost of that membership fee. Okay? So it was really designed for those seed stock producers to be collecting the data, generating the EBVs, and then selling those genetics to those commercial sheep producers. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense.
I don't mean to scare anyone away from participating.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, and I think, like you said, it's even more of an incentive for you to keep those kind of records yourself, because then you can look at your flock when you try to make those goals and go back and look at this and see what you want to do.
So like I said, every operation's different. If
right.
it's going to be profitable or not, it's up to you. If you want to talk about your individual operation later on, you send me an email, you give me a phone call. We'll talk here in a couple minutes, and we'll work through that ourselves. So if it's not right for you, no hard feelings. But yeah, if you think it's going to be benefit to you, we'll definitely work with you.
Well, that kind of leads into the next question. It says, what factors are the most important to consider for RAM and you purchase it?
Yes, yeah. So that it's a very individual basis, and this Ram Buyer's Guide, again, you can find it up on our website, which I'll take you to and show you a picture of it. This is our website. You can find this Ram Buyer's Guide under resources. Okay, and this example here, this is a Katahdin producer direct marketing grass-fed lambs to a restaurant. That's this particular scenario. I've got 3 or 4 other scenarios on there. One of them is a terminal sire cross system. One is range producing fine wool type sheep. Okay? It's going to vary depending on your operation. Okay? Again, where you put the most pressure is what's going to make you the most money. Okay? For most sheep producers, like we said, that's pounds of lamb that gets on the truck after weaning time. So I think for our maternal breeds, the big things to be looking for are your number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, maternal ability or maternal weaning weight, and then growth potential. For our terminal sires, I think you should put the most emphasis on weaning weight, post-weaning weight, and carcass conformation. For our range sheep, even our range sheep, especially right now, since commodity wool prices are where they are, which is right about the floor, even in average wool price years, the vast majority of a range operations income comes from the lamb check. Mm-hmm. One of my a friend of mine, fine wool sheep producer, has a great fine wool market, direct markets his wool. 85% of his 85% of his revenue every year comes from his lamb check still. Yeah. Even if we're focused on the fiber side, it's the number of lambs and the growth of those lambs that pays the bills. But again, that's going to be different for every single operation.
All right, so we're going a little over time here, what we had on. So I've got like about 2 or 3 more technical questions for you. These are obviously coming from people who are in the program already. How do you create contemporary groups, I guess, within your data?
Yes, so contemporary groups, we're getting a little into the technical side of things. Yeah. Okay, so contemporary groups are an important part of this because again, with our evaluation, we're trying to parse out variation in performance. Okay? And with that, we want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that's where contemporary groups or management groups come into play. So a contemporary group is simply a group of animals that were raised in the same environment at the same period of time. So if I take an example of my operation, a lamb that was born early in the year in January from a mature ewe has got a very different environment to a lamb that was born in May out of a ewe lamb. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm accounting for that when I'm putting this data into the evaluation. Okay, so we have these things called contemporary groups. Again, contemporary groups, group of lambs that were raised together at a similar time period in the same environment. We want to tell the system if we have differences in those management groups or in those contemporary groups. So say I scan my ewes during gestation and I know which ewes are carrying triplets, which ones are carrying twins, and which ones are carrying singles. And say I feed those ewes that are carrying triplets more than I did those singles and twins. Okay, I want to tell the system that, hey, I manage this group of sheep differently. Okay, so I'm going to denote those animals in a different contemporary group. So I'm going to have a contemporary group 1, and I'm going to have a contemporary group number 2 over here. And that's the first thing on contemporary groups. Okay. When we do our first steps in our genetic evaluation, we're going to look at the phenotypic variation within that contemporary group. Okay. So we're going to make sure we're comparing all the lambs within a contemporary group to each other first. Okay. And then after that, then we're going to bring in those genetic linkages and utilize that in those ABV calculations. But the most important part is that comparison to their contemporaries, so that we're not comparing a January-born lamb to a March-born lamb, or one that was in confinement to one that was out on grass. Okay? We're going to account for all that variation several steps down the road, but that first one is just comparing lambs within that contemporary group. Now, within that contemporary group, again, we're trying to test different genetic lines within that same environment. So there's some things we want to do at breeding time, okay, to make sure we're getting an accurate genetic evaluation. So in the ideal world, okay, putting that caveat out here, on the ideal world, within one contemporary group, I would have 2 different sires being used to sire lambs, and I would have at least 20 lambs out of each sire within that contemporary group. Okay? That way I have 2 different sire lines in a head-to-head comparison in the same genetic evaluation, and I've got 20 lambs out of each sire. That gives me the statistical power to make a great comparison that I want to. And then to take that ideal world one step further, I would then also have both of those sire lines also siring lambs in a different contemporary group. Okay, so that different contemporary group can be one group is based on pasture based, one group is confinement based, or one is a January lambing, one is a March lambing. Okay, it could be as simple as that. Okay, so I'd have 2 sires in a contemporary group, 20 lambs out of each sire, and a whole second set of contemporary group, 2 sires, 20 lambs out of those sires. Again, that's the ideal world. I realize vast majority of us can't get that many lambs out of 2 sires, and a lot of us can't justify having 2 sires, period. Okay, so there's a big difference between what is ideal and what we're practically able to do in our operation. For the first 2 years of my operation, I had 1 sire, and the first year I had bred him to 6 ewes. The second year I got a second sire, and I bred him to 12 ewes. Okay, far from the ideal structure, I still got good usable EBVs because I was using rams from a proven NSIP flock. Okay, if I had no genetic ties to NSIP flocks, if I just had my sheep with no information on them, it would take me 2 or 3 generations to build the accuracy levels of my EBVs to a point where I'm confident in using them in my selection decisions. Okay, so there's a big difference between what's ideal and what's practical. I would say if you can justify using 2 rams, and a lot of smaller flocks, just to minimize inbreeding, we need to utilize 2 rams. If you can utilize 2 rams in a contemporary group, that's awesome. That's a great step in the right direction. And then if you plan on, increasing in size, you can, further justify that use of multiple rams, and you can get more sires out of more ewes, or more lambs out of those sires. If you have that small situation, if you have 2 sires and say you have 10 ewes, it would be ideal if you could split those in half. So breed 5 to 1 and 5 to the other, and not 8 and 2. But again, we know that sheep don't always read the textbooks or read our plans for them. Things happen. Maybe a ram jumps out early and he breeds a whole bunch of them, and that second ram only gets to do some cleanup work. Again, it's less than ideal, but it's still good, useful information. We can still get you EBVs off of that. You don't want to underestimate swapping rams with people. NSIP's got a great network of people doing that, because we have a lot of small flocks. A lot of us are worried about inbreeding. It's really cool if I can go to my neighbor and say, hey, do you want to swap rams this year? It saves us both money. We're not having to buy a new buck every year. We both get those genetic linkages. We get those different genetic lines represented in different management groups, different operations. Good for the evaluation. It's good for us breeders.
Well, that kind of goes into the next question. How do people find NSIP ram?
Yeah, a couple different tools for that. So if you look up at the screen here, if you want to find NSIP breeders in your area, go to our website. You click on search stock with EBVs, okay? And it'll take you to a couple different lists up on our website. And if I have time here in a second, I'll pull it up here on the screen. But it lists all of our NSIP members. I've got 2 different reports up there, PDF reports, where it sorts all of our members by breed. So it has all the Katahdins together, all the Polypays together, so on. I also have it broken down by state. So if you just want to look for folks in Kentucky or just folks in West Virginia, you can sort them by state. I also have a section on there where you can click on your breed and it'll pull up a map, a Google map with pins located on all of our breeders. Okay? I'm currently updating those maps. They're a little bit outdated. Those maps are really time consuming to try to maintain. So I'm a little bit behind on getting those done, but you can get on there and you can take a pretty good estimate of what where those breeders are. And those the PDF lists, I just updated those about a week ago, I think. So I know the PDF reports under that section, those are up to date.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so we're at our last question at an hour and a half in.
Oh boy.
Do you count lambs born that are dead as a number of lambs born?
Yes, that's a great question. So which of those lambs do you record? And the short answer is yes, you do count lambs that are born dead. It's a little bit of a judgment call. Okay? So first of all, we always try to encourage full flock recording of our data. Okay? So in this situation, say you have a litter of 3 lambs that are born, 2 of them are alive and 1 are dead. Okay? You might be tempted to just record 2 lambs and leave off that 3rd one. Okay? But that's not an accurate representation of what she actually gave you. Okay? So we have some tools in place to help you do that. And I'm going to take a step back here, and I want to focus on this ID number here, okay, to start with. We have some tools available that you can record these lambs that we can still use those animals in the evaluation, but you don't get billed for those lambs. Okay, that's the big thing, is you don't want to submit that 3rd lamb because you don't want to pay for it because it's dead. Okay, so there's different ways within this ID number that you can code that you don't get charged for those lambs. I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to break down this ID number. A lot of people get a little bit worried when I say you have to assign a 16-digit ID number to all of your sheep. Okay, that's a lot. I understand that. But when you break it down, each of these digits stands for something in this ID number. So each animal, the first 6 digits is a flock ID number that's unique to your flock, okay, or your goat herd. So this particular flock, this is Betty Samsel Hughes Newford out in Montana. All of her sheep start with 610028. Okay, so every sheep that's born on her place starts with this first 6 digits. Okay, the first 2 digits of that breed or of that ID indicates the breed. Okay, so all the polypays start off with a 6-2. Okay, all the Katahdins start off with a 6-4. Okay, then this the 028, that is the unique flock ID within that breed. So Betty was the 28th flock within the Targhee breed. Okay, so first 6 is the flock ID number. I assign that number to you when you join NSIP. The next 4 digits are the year of birth of that animal. Okay, so this ram here, he was born in 2011. Okay, so out of our first 10 digits, we've already got all those covered, just with the flock ID and the year of birth. The last 6 digits, those are a unique identifier. Those can be whatever you want them to be. What most folks do is that is going to be the ear tag number of the sheep. Okay, what Betty did is she likes to repeat the last 2 digits of the year of birth. So this is 2011, so we do 11. And then that ram was H238. That was his ear tag number. Okay. So back to your question at hand, how do we code those lambs? Okay. For a lamb that was born dead, in digits 11, 12, and 13, you're going to put the letters DAB, or dead at birth. Okay. So then that lamb still goes into the system. The dam gets credit for having that lamb, but she doesn't get credit for raising that lamb, okay? And you don't get charged for that dead lamb. Okay? So that's a way that you can record all of the lambs that are born. We can still get an accurate representation of the reproductive capability of that ewe. You don't get billed for those lambs. There's other scenarios, though, that we'll also use. So we know that not every lamb is going to be a rock star. We know that there's going to be lambs from, weaning time. We know they're not going to be a breeding prospect. We're going to put that lamb in the freezer, or we're going to ship it down the road. Okay, we still want to use the data in that from that lamb in the EBV calculations of its sire and its dam and its contemporaries, and every single relative of that animal. That individual animal's weight is going to impact the EBV calculations of all those relatives. Okay, so we still want to include that animal. So what we can do is in digits 11 and 12. We can put the letters CU or Charlie uniform, which stands for call. That means we're going to call that lamb. Okay. That means still put the data into the system, still use it in the EBV calculations of all the other contemporaries, all the other relatives, but you're not going to get billed for that lamb. Okay. So that's a good way that you can record data on your entire lamb crop, even though we know we're going to ship some on down the road. Saves a little bit of money. We still build the robustness of our data sets. While people are doing the poll, I do need to appease the powers that be and just mention that, say, well, first of all, thank you all for taking part in the webinar here tonight. I appreciate the chance to visit. NSIP, we receive a lot of support from the American Sheep Industry Association through the Let's Grow program, from the National Sheep Industry Improvement Center, and from the American Lamb Board. If it weren't for those folks that are help out, support NSIP, both financially and moral support, we wouldn't be where we are today. We've invested a lot of time and effort in NSIP over the last 6 or 7 years, going from about 100 members to over 500 members. If it weren't for these industry organizations, that wouldn't be possible. So, got to say thanks to all those folks. And if anyone has the time or interest, we do have another cool tool I can show you real quick. Yeah, so this is an online searchable database. So all of our sheep on NSIP, we can find and sort through all the EBVs through this really cool tool. This was funded through a grant through the ASI Let's Grow program. And it's just a way to help filter through these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sheep with EBVs to find one that's right for you. We can sort through by group. So we're going to take, I'm going to be selfish and I'm going to look at polypace. Okay, so I'm going to pick maternal wool breeds. Okay, under that, I'm going to pick polypace. Okay. Now I can start to refine the entire data set. Okay, because if I just look at maternal polypay records, and I come down here and I find all the sheep that are on there, I've got, I think there's about 20 lambs per page, and I've got 4,216 pages, or sets of pages to sort through. So a lot of sheep, okay? I can refine that and say I just want to look at ram lambs. I want to look at rams that were born after January 1st, 2020. Okay? And I just want to look for rams. Okay? I type those in there. I update my results. And out of 4,000 pages, now I'm down to 91 pages of animals. Okay? So this is all the 2020 born polypay ram lambs in NSIP. These are the ID numbers. These are all the EBVs that they have. So if I want to start to sort through these and I want to find, say, the very best sheep, okay, I'm going to come over here to the USA Maternal Index tab. I'm going to click on that, and it just sorted all those 92 pages or 91 pages of sheep by that USA Maternal Index. So I've got the highest one right here at the top. Click on View Details, and I find that this polypay ram lamb was raised by Brandon Knutson, Diamond K Sheep Company up in Wisconsin. Here's his EBVs. Here's the contact information for Brandon and Michelle if you want to give them a call and find that ram. Lots of cool information on there, okay? We can also kind of get lost in this deal though. So say I've got this ram lamb, say I call up Brandon and I say, hey, I want to buy your 2103 buck lamb. And he says, oh, sorry, too bad. He was a really good ram. I sold him a week ago. And I can say, oh, well, does he have any brothers? Well, I simply come here to the sire, click on sire, and now I'm taken to the sire's page. Now I can see that he's got 113 siblings in 2 different flocks. Here's that sire's set of EBVs. And here's all those siblings. So these are all the lambs out of that particular sire. So a cool way that you can sort through tons of data.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a whole nother webinar in itself.
Yeah.
How to walk through that with some scenarios.
So then if I've got particular like EBVs I'm looking for, so like me, I'm interested in number of lambs weaned. Rather than sorting through all that, I want to come here to my number of lambs weaned, and I want to say that ram has to have at least a, let's say a 38% number of lambs weaned. Okay, so I just type that in that box, I update it, and it's just filtered out the dozen or so
you got
lambs
one page.
have that.
Yeah.
I'm down to 1 page. Yeah. So by doing that, you can go through that ram buyer's guide, And again, you can figure out, say, I want to focus on these 3 traits.
Yeah.
So I want to find one that has a weaning weight of at least a 2, and I want to find one that has a post-weaning fecal egg count. That's a maximum. He has to have at least a -20. Okay, I can type in all these different criteria and find just the sheep that are going to match those criteria. They're going to be beneficial to my operation. Really awesome tool.
That is awesome. Well, Rusty, thanks again. Super appreciate it. I really hope we get to do this again soon.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And like I said, hopefully in the near future we'll be able to do this in person, so we can do a lot more in person.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. All right. Well, we look forward to it. So,
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks,
you.
everybody.